Welcome to the Bookshop at the End of the Internet. This podcast is dedicated to helping book lovers discover new authors. Like all the best bookshops, this podcast is filled with all kinds of books and all kinds of authors. So tune in, browse around, find a new author, and discover a new favorite book at the Bookshop at the End of the Internet. I'm Stacey Horan, author, book lover, and host of the Bookshop at the End of the Internet. This is episode number 234. For more information about this or any of our episodes, go to my website, staceyhoran.com. If you enjoy the podcast, leave us a review, like us on social media, and share us with your friends, family, and fellow readers. In today's episode of the Bookshop at the End of the Internet, I'm chatting with author Keith G. McWalter about his new science fiction novel, Lifers. In this novel, the solution to extending human life has been found, and it is secretly unleashed upon the world's population in the form of an airborne pandemic. When people stop dying, the pressures of an ever-increasing population create a whole host of political and socio-economic ramifications. In Lifers, Keith explores the implications and downsides of larger numbers of people continuing to live much longer lives than they do now. Keith admits that he didn't need to make up much of the science in this sci-fi novel. The creative part was imagining what would happen if suddenly, overnight, people lived for an additional 100 years or more. What would be the effects on families, economics, medical care, politics, and so on? In this episode, I'll chat with Keith about his writing journey, why he became interested in the science of longevity, and why his novels include the element of illuminating the mundane, as well as a few other things. Coming up. Keith McWalter, I want to thank you very much for joining me today on the podcast.
Pleased to be here. Thank you.
I thought what we could do today is start by talking about your new book titled Lifers. If you don't mind, tell us a little bit about this book, and in particular, what inspired you to write it?
Well, a number of years ago, I've like so many of us, I've come to a point in life where I'm more and more interested in longevity, and not just in the sort of faddish aspects of it, but the actual science of living longer, healthier lives. And I did a lot of nonfiction reading in that area. And a lot of those books that I sourced for my research are listed in the back of Lifers as acknowledgments. But what struck me, and I learned a great deal, and much of it very useful about just health and longevity in general. But what struck me about all of these accounts and all the efforts being made around lengthening human lifespans was two things primarily. One is it's at this point certainly considered a luxury product almost. It's presented that way, and the thought is that for the next many decades, the kinds of treatments that will come out of longevity science will be mostly for the rich and the few. And secondly, that no one in all these volumes of very erudite nonfiction literature that I read, no one discusses in any detail the implications of large numbers of people living significantly longer lives than they do today. We've had, hundreds of years to adjust to very gradually lengthening lifespans. But the possibility is that we could have, and certainly what these people are working on, is suddenly vastly increasing the human lifespan rather in the space of a couple of generations. And that would be not only dramatic, but in a lot of ways complicating for families and for individuals and for economies. And I wanted to write a book that would sort of examine those unspoken implications of longevity. This thing that we think of as a obvious good could have its downsides, or at least its ramifications that aren't discussed very much, and I wanted to dramatize them. So that's mainly the thrust of the novel.
And what was the spark for you? What was that thing, that moment when you thought, okay, you know what? I think there's a book here. Let me see what I can do with it.
Well, I think it was when I began to think about concretely what, in say in my own case, in my own family and uh, my friends and neighbors, what would happen if suddenly all of us were facing 50 or 100 years more of life than we are right now? We all have our sort of private, personal expectation of our lifespans. But what if suddenly, in a span of a very short period of time, we were all confronted with the likelihood, not just the possibility, but the likelihood that we would live an additional 50 or 100 years, which is sort of the central premise of the book. How would you feel? How would your relationships change? How would the economics of your family life change? How would the way you make and save money change? All of that. So once that sort of personal insight clicked, then I was off to the races with a lot of much more fanciful scenarios about different people in different walks of life trying to grapple with that sort of realization.
Well, let's talk about two things. I want to talk about setting and characters, but
Hmm.
let's do the setting first because I think it's important for people to understand where it takes place, physically where it takes place, when it takes place because that's another aspect, and what the situation looks like on the ground. So can you set this up for us?
Sure. I took, and this was the fun part for me, because my first book, which we can talk about later, was much more concretely realistic and very, very personal. And this book is much more, frankly, entertaining in the sense that it's both fanciful and it is more in the thriller vein than the sort of domestic literary vein that I was writing in for the first book. And in that latter, in the thriller vein, you get to do a lot of things you can't do when you're trying to write a domestic novel. So there are a number of some exotic, some mundane settings that are sprinkled throughout the book. And most of them places that I've been lucky enough to either live in or visit, and but know pretty intimately. And they range from Munich, Germany, to Lake Garda, Italy, to New York City, to Napa Valley, and so on, and Tokyo for that matter. And in each of these places, a different character is dealing, sometimes the same character is dealing with an immediate challenge related to this crisis that's befalling the world as people start to live dramatically longer lives in a very over a very short period of change. And some of them in the classic sort of disaster novel, some of them are scientists who are trying to deal with the source of the problem. Some of them are politicians who are trying to react to it in constructive ways and sometimes in repressive ways. And some of them are people facilitating solutions to adapt to the problem. And I can get more specific about all of that. But there's a cast of about, 10 prime characters and the book is told from their different perspectives. So it hopscotches around both among the characters' heads and frankly around the world, which was kind of fun to write and I hope fun to read.
And I don't think it's too much of a spoiler to explain what happens at the beginning of the book to create this situation that basically the whole world is now dealing with. Can you shed
Yeah,
some light for listeners on what has happened?
sure. The trigger is, and this was actually drawn the character who creates this worldwide problem was actually drawn from some reading about real life characters in Silicon Valley. And I sort of amalgamated a bunch of them into this one character called Gustav Zinnemann. And he is a very, very wealthy, very successful, almost not to not to name names, he's sort of an Elon Musk type, but he's much older than Elon and has been as he faces his own adult, aged, the latter part of his life. He begins to think about longevity science and how to create a breakthrough in living a much longer life. So he marshals his wealth and his contacts to work intensively on this problem over a period of years and comes to a solution that requires a delivery mechanism. That is, how are you going to, once he creates this genome that will revolutionize how basically reset the cellular function for a human being to a much more robust state, how do you deliver that into the human body? And he hires an assistant who, and she is a very, very well educated and beautifully technically accomplished woman who works with him in his Palo Alto laboratory to try to develop that kind of delivery system. And she disagrees with his whole project secretly. She believes that this is misguided in its essence, and that the way he's going to use it, which is to make a heck of a lot of money, is also rather immoral. So she basically finds a way to create a delivery system, but the problem or the solution from her perspective that she creates is it is communicable. It is basically viral, and it can be spread from person to person, which is not what its creator intended, but what she adapts it to. And the result is basically a contagion of longevity that spreads very rapidly around the world and takes a long while to be recognized because, of course, we don't know we're going to live longer until we start living longer. But once masses of people break through the 100-year mark and the 120-year mark, and this is happening all around the world, people understand that something dramatic and unique has happened, and people scramble to begin to deal with it. But that's the trigger point, and there are a number of important female characters. In fact, most of the lead characters in the book are women. But this young immunologist is one of the primary triggers for the whole storyline.
Yeah, yeah. Well, let's talk about some of those characters. You mentioned a number of them are women. Let's deal with maybe three or four, if you don't mind. Introduce us to some of the key players, because they have roles and how they help you as the writer discuss or investigate some of these implications that you were mentioning.
Yeah. I wanted a politician or someone who is versed in politics because I think so many of the ramifications of this would be political or would have to be addressed through political means, such as overpopulation, Social Security, medical care, etc. And so one of the characters is a woman named Marianne Altman, who is a former Washington lobbyist and an heiress to a real estate fortune. And she and her husband, who is also a Washington politician, decide to try, once it's obvious that both that something dramatic has happened and that it might threaten their lifestyle, both because they're going to run out of money and because there are political ramifications, and talk about trying to deal with the masses of older people who are suddenly in the world by fairly repressive means. They decide they need to create a sort of counter movement to that whole process and to provide a sanctuary, to create a sanctuary somewhere for large numbers of superannuated people. And they said about that in a fairly, that's detailed in the book. They said about that in a fairly systematic way. So that's one of the main characters. Adele Pritchard is someone they know from their time back in the Carter White House when they were all together there, but they're now in their hundreds. And Adele is a biowarfare specialist who formerly was with the CIA and the National Security Council. And she too is she's like 120 as the book opens. But her job, her function is she's created an ad hoc global organization dedicated to dealing with the spread of what people begin to call the longevity plague. So she's coming at it from a much more technical perspective and from a much more preventative point of view to try to stop this from happening and perhaps to reverse it. So she's a scientist. She's also, she's an internationalist in the sense that she's had a lot of global experience in dealing with outbreaks of one kind or another, Ebola and the like, and she's trying to find a way to contain it. And then there's one of my favorites is Claire Landis, who is Marion, and Marion's the woman I mentioned first, the politician, Marion and Dan's granddaughter, and she's a feminist philosopher and author of books on death and dying. And she takes the point of view that this is not just an economic slash political slash social problem, but that it's morally wrong for human beings to try to escape death. That one of our biggest problems as humans is our inability to confront death and to accept it and to integrate it into our philosophies and into our awareness of daily life. So she becomes inadvertently a sort of, because of her views, becomes the leader of a sort of anti-lifer backlash that develops as people begin to resent the absorption of resources and ability to cope that these masses of super aged people are creating. So those are three. I'll throw in one more because he's interesting. At least he's a guy, one of the few men in the picture. His name is Tobin Maxwell, and he's got some issues because he grew up a biracial young man in San Francisco, but he also is on the spectrum, as they say. He's got Asperger's and OCD, but he's a brilliant social media programmer. And he's been hired by a company to develop some influencing programs that will cause the super aged, the lifers, as we call them in the book, the super aged individuals to not want to live longer and indeed to think about ending their lives on their own volition. And that's going to happen through a drug that's developed to deal with this problem, but people have to be willingly take it. And his job is to influence them to do so. And he's got a very, very intellectual and very detached view of all that. And yet he's also got relatives, his grandparents, who are deeply committed to him and love him, and he loves them. And he has to grapple with the fact that what he's doing is different from and antithetical to their very happy lives out in Santa Fe, New Mexico, which is another venue of the story. So those are the central characters, as well as Gustav Zimmerman, who I mentioned earlier, who's the creator of this, the evil genius, if you will, behind all of this. Although he's not very evil, he develops over the course of the novel too.
You touched on a few things, and so I wanted to talk about the world building you had to do for this,
Mm-hmm.
because you take into account, like you said, social media and those kinds of things, because all of that is playing a part, a greater and greater part in society. And then you've projected this into the not too distant future.
Right.
You've also had to create vocabulary
Mm-hmm.
and new terms to describe things that are happening and other things you've had to create in order to kind of build this world out. And you also, other things have played in a role, right? And the environment has changed. Our planet's physical environment has changed things. So there's a lot of pressure on humans
Mhm.
now, in addition to this pandemic,
Mhm.
this that has happened. So what did you draw upon from that research you had done early on? I'm curious what you use, what real life facts and ideas that you use to create all this, and what you decided you were going to just make up. So where was the balance that you struck?
Well, in terms of world building, as contrasted with the basic science of the longevity, which is really, I took some pains to be somewhat realistic about the foundations of that. So
Mm-hmm.
there wasn't much imagination involved there. But for the rest of it, and I'll touch on a number of aspects of it, it was sort of classic speculation. Let's take where we are today and project it into 20 or 30 years distant, and and what would you expect to have happened? I mean, if you really let your imagination run, but realistically run forward into what life will be like for, say, our children and grandchildren, what will that world look like? Well, one aspect, as you mentioned, is we will have either come to some pretty awful results in terms of climate change, or we will have adapted to it. And my guess is that we will adapt to it slowly, but sometimes rather dramatically. For instance, I have in the background of a lot of the discussion, there's people have to abandon the barrier islands of Florida and have to retreat from the seacoasts in order to, escape sea level rise and hurricanes and floods and whatnot. Fires have ravaged large parts of which is sort of prescient given what's going on in LA right now. Fires have ravaged large parts of the West Coast, and much of that needs to be either not so much abandoned as structures are rebuilt to be much more fire retardant. And there's a whole chapter of the book that takes place in a house that our friend I just mentioned, Tobin, hides out in to do some research, do some work on his algorithms, where he lives basically inside a fireproof bunker up in Napa Valley because that's what people live in the year 2045.
Mm-hmm.
And communication, the internet, I project, will be defunct by then. We will have something other than the internet. Doesn't mean we won't have instantaneous communication across the globe in a similar way, but it will be different. It will be much more personal, much more distributed. We won't have big social media platforms. We'll have a much more granular kind of interpersonal communication. It'll be electronic. And in the book, it's chips, but I won't say any more about them because that's one of the more fun concepts that runs through the book. But it won't look like what we have now. And finally, transportation. Now, how do people get around? And my premise is that people do not travel on fossil fueled aircraft anymore, that they become actually illegal, and that you have to move by electrical powered drones of one kind or another. And that means shorter distances can be traveled than is true today, where you can blast ourselves halfway around the globe in a matter of a day. I just went to the Maldives in October, which is a lifelong dream. And it took, it was literally on the far side, the farthest point away from where I am now in Florida, as you can get on the planet. And it took me, like, in terms of flying time, 18 hours. you know.
Right.
So that kind of travel is is uh, is no longer possible in the book, and indeed the only kinds of or only kind of flying by fossil fuel as we do now, almost exclusively, is reserved to the military. So those are a few of the elements of the sort of bigger picture, the world building, as the phrase goes, to that that I drew upon to try to make a credible future reality.
And people listening might think, well, it sounds very sci-fi, very science fiction. But what
Hmm.
about the idea that maybe it's less straightforward science fiction and a bit more social science fiction?
Yeah, that's exactly the phrase I like to use for it
Yeah,
is social science fiction. It is not in the sense that technology, while it's somewhat important to the plot and to the character development, it's not in the forefront. What's in the forefront is relationships and how people react around an issue, but it isn't the only issue they're dealing with. Some have had, have love relationships. Some are jealous of one another. Uh, some are dealing with identity crises. Some have gone through divorces, and it's all about the personal, and that's and a lot of the quote unquote action happens in conversations. It's people sitting around debating, as we do about so many things today, about how we should feel about this, what we should do about it. We as individuals, as well as, macro political entities, but we as families. So I wanted to forefront that, and it's certainly my instinct because that's my basic fictional style of writing is to write interpersonal drama as opposed to classic sci-fi, which I think of as having technology in the very forefront and sort of the people and their natures and their relationships are sort of secondary, although there's certainly lots of exceptions to that generalization. But yes, it is sci-fi in the sense the premise is barely fictional. It's not going to be fictional in the next 10 or 20 years. That
right.
is the developments that underlie it. But it's science fiction-y in that sense, and I hope fun in that way because it is highly speculative. But it's about relationships and it's about social issues and interpersonal issues that we deal with now and will deal with no matter how long we live. And that's part of the underlying point is that age, having the prospect of much longer lives changes some things about how we relate to one another, but not everything.
Right.
And so that's part of I hope, the fun of it.
Yeah. Well, the book certainly gives readers a lot of fuel for thought. It sort of forces them to, like you said, deal with these things that not a lot of people talk about.
Yep, hopefully.
How do you feel about those those considerations now that you've studied it so much and you've written a book about it? Have your views on those sort of implications or those bigger questions, have they changed, or do you find yourself again just asking more questions, maybe with less answers but more questions?
Yeah, I mean, one of the one of the obvious questions that came to me is like, okay, what would you do? In other words, one of the cruxes of the whole personal story of the book, or the story of the personalities in the book, is they have a choice. At some point, you have a choice whether you want to live an extremely long life or you don't. And you know, as I sit here, healthy and not young, but not super old yet, I would welcome. I think. I mean, this is where you have to put a big, you know, comma or parenthesis around it. I think I would welcome another 50 or 100 years of life because my life has been lucky and privileged and mostly lucky. And so, yes, I don't like the idea of checking out, and I would love to have more time of the delightful life I've had. But not everyone would feel that way, and And I think that so few of us have had to really come to grips with the nature of time as it extends into real old age. And mind you, we're talking about old age that doesn't mean decrepitude. In other words, one of the aspects of this aging is that yes, people get older and older, and yes, some things about their bodies change as they move into their hundreds. But basically, a lot of the ailments of old age don't occur because of the science underlying the changes that have happened. And so they're relatively healthy. And if you could subsist in that way for longer, I'd grab it, I think. But I also have read enough in the philosophy of mortality to know that there are some real arguments to be made that, at some point life, can get boring or wearing or repetitious in a way that might not make you want to persist for another 100 years. And we are so trained, frankly, subliminally or subconsciously, so well trained in accepting these phases of life that we have the 0 to 20, and then the 20 to retirement, and then the post-retirement years, these three big acts or stages of life. We're so inculcated in that the idea that final stage might be longer than the first two is just not in it's not in our thinking and not in our emotional setup. And all of that would have to change. So I recognize that I could be completely wrong, but I, gee, if this happened tomorrow it was an opportunity that could be had tomorrow, I would probably take it, but with the reservations that are portrayed in the book.
Mhm.
and 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 that's the point of the book, is to make us stop and think, okay, what would that really be like?
Right. Well, I want to mention quickly your first book, When We Were All Still Alive. Now, you mentioned that you deal with, in Lifers, you deal a lot with the interpersonal. You said that's sort of the forefront. Tech and the sci-fi elements are sort of secondary. So you, in your first book, you deal again with the interpersonal, people's relationships, family, the domestic situation. So is this is this something that you consciously gravitate towards in your writing, or is it a case of you strike upon an idea, you start writing it, and the idea that you focus on these kinds of issues hits you kind of as you're writing it or even afterwards? Do you know that this is where are you aiming for that, or is it sort of subconscious?
Yeah, I know where I'm aiming,
Mm,
because and it is all, we're all products, especially we writers, are all products of what we've read. And I grew up reading literary fiction. That
hmm
was just I was, in a educational world, and I was an English major in college. I was in an educational world and a social world where literary domestic fiction specifically, and I'm talking about people like Wallace Stegner and John Updike and Philip Roth, mostly guys in those days, were writing beautifully written novels about domestic life, and often didn't get beyond the four corners of domestic life. I mean, it wasn't, there was, Updike later on got into political issues and racial issues and that kind of thing, but all felt sort of tacked on to his fundamental interest, in people like Wallace Stegner's fundamental interest in interpersonal relationships in a very micro, very interior way. So that even whether or not you got in a car or not, forget about technology, whether you were in a car or not didn't matter. It was,
right.
let alone broader things. It was all about what was being said and done between people in rather ordinary circumstances. And that's part of the beauty of it, is that people like him, like those guys, and they were mostly guys in those days, uh, were talking about very ordinary lives. and making them glorious through their interior light. And James Salter is another one I should not leave out. If anybody's interested in this whole genre, go read some James Salter. What a remarkable writer he was. But they were all about illuminating the mundane, and that was my inspiration as a young writer, and basically is just wired into me by now. So that the first book, the through line from the first book, which you mentioned, to this one is the subject of mortality, because in the first book, the protagonist loses his wife and has to deal with to an accident and has to deal with the emotional and other fallout of that on a very interior from a very interior perspective. So it's all told from his mostly from his point of view. But the through line is how do you grapple with the fact that the people we love most are not going to be around forever. If we're lucky, we might outlive them, or they might outlive us, so we don't have to deal with losing them. And how do we deal with our own mortality? How do we think about it? How do we react to it? And do we think enough about it? And my argument has always been we don't. We don't think enough about it, and we would be different and probably better people if we did, if we could internalize some of that awareness.
Yeah.
So anyway, long-winded answer to your question about source, the instinct. I'm just trained that way from my reading background. Not even so much my education, because most of what I read was not by assignment, but my sort of aesthetic inclination in terms of books has always been towards that kind of writing and that kind of writer that's interested in primarily in illuminating our interior lives. And so that's what I try to wiggle into even something like what some people would think of as primarily a sci-fi novel. And
Right.
I hope that follows through.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, what are you working on now? Do you have more books in the works, or do you have a plan for what you're gonna
I
what
do.
the third book will be?
I do. I
Hmm.
am halfway through a sequel, although I'm trying to make it a standalone sequel, if you know what I mean.
Hmm.
Uh, but a sequel to the first book, that is a sequel to the very realistic, down to earth when we were all still alive. And it follows this same guy who lost his wife into another phase of his life. I'm hoping to be done with that by in the next 2, 3 months if I can keep my word count per day up, although I'm often not very good at that. And then I want to go back and write a sequel to the second book, because one of that is To Lifers, the book we've been mostly talking about, which is funner in a sense, more fun to write because of all the speculative aspects of it. But
Right.
but one of the things you were alluding to earlier about world building, there's in the process of world building for that book, there's a lot of things that are just mentioned in passing. For instance, the whole thing about abandoning sections of the United States is just mentioned as background to, something that everybody understands and accepts. Similarly, the whole question of how this technology developed from an internet-based world to a more distributed electronic communication world, that's just a given in the book. There's allusions to a secessionist movement in the United States that happened in the 2040s when groups of states broke off from the Union. All these things are sort of the background of the world in which the protagonists live in the book. But all of that could be explored much more thoroughly and described. And I want to go back and pick up those sort of random elements that are just world background, like wallpaper to the story, and explore them better. And at the very end of the book, I won't spoil this, but at the very end of the book, there's a a mechanism that I want to use. It has to do with time, but it's not time travel per se. I will leave it at that. And there's a mechanism that's described that would be a great way, a vehicle for sort of developing some of those ideas that were just alluded to in the book. So those are the two projects. So a sequel to the first one, a sequel to the second one, and we'll see how that all goes. But that's the
Right.
idea.
Good, good. Well, it sounds like you'll be busy for a while.
Yep, hope so.
Well, if people want to learn more about you and the books, look for new releases, that sort of thing, where can they go to find you and that information?
The best place is my author page, the website page, which is Keith McWalter Writes, all run together, WRITS, TES, sorry, .com. And that has a lot of information both about prior books, both nonfiction essay collections and the current books, and also where to buy them, and including the usual, big platforms. But also, I always like to encourage people to patronize your local bookstore first and foremost. And there's also some information in there about events. There's an event coming up here in Florida that I'll be attending with one of the nonfiction writers that I relied on to help write Lifers, who is going to appear with me at a presentation, a discussion, sort of panel discussion about longevity down here on the Gulf Coast in Florida in March. So that's the best place to get a lot of information.
Good, good. And you mentioned that people can go to the website and find out where to buy the books. That's correct.
Yes, there's any number of big platforms, the usual Goodreads, Amazon. It's a Scribner's. It's distributed by Simon and Schuster, so you can go to the Simon and Schuster website and get it there. But again, my default is always to encourage people to find your local bookstore and have them order a few copies and buy one. Or
Excellent. Two. Right. Keith, thank you very much for joining me today on the podcast. And I want to wish you luck with Lifers and the books in progress. We'll keep our fingers crossed for those. So congratulations on everything you've accomplished so far. Best of luck with the rest of your writing journey.
Thank you so much, Stacey. Thanks for having me, and enjoy the conversation.
The Bookshop at the End of the Internet is a podcast dedicated to helping book lovers discover new authors. Like any good bookshop, this podcast features a wide variety of books by the equally varied and interesting authors who felt compelled to write them. This podcast gives you a chance to meet these wonderful writers and discover your next must-read book. Listen to the authors describe their books and tell you their stories in their own words. My interviews feature books from all genres and authors from all walks of life, including those who are indie published, as well as those published by small presses and large publishing houses. Looking for unique, not so easy to find books for yourself, a friend, or a book club? Tune into this podcast and find your newest favorite author, or maybe a soon-to-be bestseller. This podcast, like all the best bookshops, is filled with all kinds of books and all kinds of authors. Tune in, browse around, find a new author, and discover a new favorite book. You never know what treasures you might find in the Bookshop at the End of the Internet.